right.
All right, take it away.
Thank you everybody for your patience with our little technical difficulties now, and welcome everyone to pivot tables with Microsoft Excel. I'm going to start off by showing you a pivot table. This is a pivot table that represents the countries that all of you are coming from. Yesterday, Catherine gave me a list of the attendees and their countries, and I made a little pivot table out of it, and it shows that there are people from Tanzania and Malaysia, as well as lots of people from the United States, and that's just super exciting. So I just want to say welcome to everybody. I am Michael Milton. As Catherine just told you, I wrote Headfirst Data Analysis, which came out in August, and I wrote Headfirst Excel, which I just got my first copy. It's around here somewhere, but I got my first copy yesterday. It should be available for purchase. Well, it's available for purchase now, but it should be in your hands within a week, I would guess. I am an author, but I'm also a data analysis consultant and a trainer. So I would urge you strongly to connect with me and be in touch with me and email me if you have any questions or comments about my work or any other thing in regards to data analysis. I also want to say a shout out to my editor, Brian, who couldn't be here. He's where he deserves to be right now, which is on an island in the Caribbean, but he helped me with Excel, and he's deserves a lot of recognition for that. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly about the book I just wrote, not because I'm trying to pitch it, but because I want to sort of situate what it is that I'm going to do in this particular webinar in the context of what I think is important with Excel generally. And what's reflected in the book. I think that pivot tables are the second most important thing that you need to know if you are learning about how to use Microsoft Excel in a more powerful way, not just opening and closing documents and keeping lists and printing stuff. If you really want to start using the powerful features of Excel, pivot tables are the second most important thing. The most important thing that you need to know is formulas. And Headfirst Excel is a very formula-centric book. Even in the chapters that aren't about formulas, and even in the pivot table chapters, you're constantly learning and practicing formulas so that by the end of it, you will be a formula guru, even if you started off never having written a formula before. What really distinguishes people who have strong Excel abilities from the ones who just can get by are the ones who know how to use formulas. In this presentation, it's not important that you know how to use formulas. I'm going to bust out with a few of them, but the point is always going to be about something besides the formulas. I can talk about the formulas I use in more detail at the end of the presentation if you're interested, but this is purely about pivot tables, which you can basically get into even if you're not terribly strong with formulas yet. Some of you, from what I'm saying right now, may realize that this particular webinar is not for super advanced pivot table and Excel users. There were a few people in the comments who wanted to learn about, OLAP cubes and macros and VBA and that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, you are in a very small minority, and most of the people who are interested in this presentation have never used pivot tables before and want to learn how. So while everyone's welcome, this pivot table presentation is for people who are learning pivot tables for the first time. Let me describe how this presentation is going to go in the next 30 or 40 minutes. We're going to jump right in and make a pivot table. I'm going to quickly show you how they work. And then I'm going to get into a topic that's really important and often isn't very well covered in curriculum for pivot tables, which is what sort of data do I use in pivot tables? What sort of data is amenable? Because pivot tables aren't just some happy algorithm that you can put anything into and get good results out. There's a very specific type of data that pivot tables excel at managing, and I'm going to get into that a little bit. Then we're going to go back and go more slowly through the individual elements of a pivot table. I'm going to go quickly on my first pass, and if you don't understand it all, I don't expect you to. We're going to go a little bit more slowly through it in part 3. And then in the fourth step, I'm going to screw up. I'm going to embarrass myself and make a big mistake that is kind of contrived here, but that I've done in real life. And at that point, I'm going to challenge you to watch what I'm doing and see if you can figure out what it is that I'm doing wrong. After that, I'm going to give you a few little tips on how to present pivot tables to the consumers of your analysis, your customers, your clients, your bosses, or whoever it is that you're creating a data analysis for, other people. And then we're going to take pivot tables into another dimension, literally. I'm going to bring in some formulas and show you how to do some things with pivot tables that, in my experience, just completely blows people's minds. And finally, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. So before we get into pivot tables, there's just one more thing that I need to, a caveat that I need to take care of, which has to do with the versions of Excel that you may be using. I'm going to be operating inside of Excel 2007 for Windows right now. There are a bunch of different versions of Excel, including Excel 2010, which is coming out very shortly. And there's a whole bunch of Mac versions as well. For the purposes of this presentation, it's not going to be too terribly important what version you're using. All the features that I'm going to cover are going to be present in one form or another no matter how old school you are in terms of your Excel, the version of Excel that you're using. If you Google Excel 2010 pivot tables, there are a number of blog entries from Microsoft about modifications to pivot tables that are going to be incorporated in the next version of Excel, but none of those would change how I would teach pivot tables to a newbie today. Okay, so let's get started making a pivot table. First thing that we need is some data, and I wanted to come up with as salacious a data set as possible and without, of course, offending anybody. So what I decided to do was to get some data from the Federal Election Commission of the United States to look at how much money people running for Congress have raised for their 2010 election campaigns. For those of you who are not in the United States and don't keep up with U.S. politics, we're going to have a congressional midterm election this year, and the Federal Election Commission is a regulatory agency that collects data that describes how much money the candidates raise. And so I have that data. The two links that you're looking at right now, if you are interested in playing around with the data as I'm going along in the pivot tables, you can feel free to download it. If not, it's no big deal. This webinar is going to be, you can catch it on repeat, and if you want to go through it at a later date, you're welcome to do that. There's original data, which I wouldn't suggest that you download. I'm going to be using a polished data set that has some fields thrown out that aren't necessary and has a little bit more extra stuff in it that I put in for the purposes of the presentation. So I'm hoping that by now that you've written down the polished data web link, and I'm going to keep moving on. Okay, so let's take a look at this data. I'm going to pull it up. I'm just going to start off by going really slowly through this data to describe what it is, and then it'll make a little bit more sense as to what it is that I'm doing with it. Each row of this data set represents somebody who is running for a 2010 U.S. congressional midterm election. In column A, we just have the names of those individuals. In column B, we have the office. H and S stand for House and Senate. We have the state and district. They're the places where these people are running for office. We have their party, which is overwhelmingly Dem and Rep for Democrat and Republican. We have a description, which describes whether they're an incumbent, somebody who currently holds office and is running for re-election, or a challenger, or whether alternatively the seat is completely open. And we also have the city and state and zip code where those candidates live. And then we have some financial data. We have the amount of money that they have raised for their campaign since January of 2009, the amount of money that they've spent, the total disbursement, the cash on hand, how much money they have in their checking account right now, and the debt that they have. So this data provides a pretty potentially very interesting snapshot of what individuals are running where and how much money they've raised, and all that sort of thing. It is kind of a long data set. If I do Control down or Command down in Mac, I can go down there and see that there is over 2,200 people who are running. So I think a lot of people, when they get a big data set like this, would look at it and feel kind of overwhelmed and want to try to get a grip on, okay, exactly of all this data, I mean, what in the world is going on inside of here? So our task is to summarize that. And one way of summarizing that might be just to create a table where I say dim and rep. Let's say I want to look at the number of Democrats and Republicans. In that case, I can create a formula, and again, you don't need to memorize this formula, but I'm just want to show you how you would implement a pivot table using formulas, and it's kind of a pain. I can type in count ifs and select the criteria of dim, and then select this particular cell, P4, which has the word expression dim in it. And I can see that there's 734 Democrats and there's 1,278 Republicans who are running for this. But say I wanted to break this out a little bit farther. I could get rid of these and break it out by incumbent and challenger. And now here the formula that I need to write is going to become even more of a pain than that one. I have to type in count ifs again, and I'd have to go back and select my party field, and then select the party, and then go and select the description field, and then select the description. Then I have to go back and put a whole bunch of dollar signs in, which for those of you who are familiar with formulas, it has to do with absolute and relative references, a complicated topic that you get to avoid when you're creating pivot tables. And there you go. There's my formula. I can copy it and paste it for everybody there. This is a pretty simple summary, but I had to go through a bunch of steps, and I had to create a pretty long and elaborate formula in order to get at it. And if I wanted to change this summary, I'd have to rewrite the whole thing. Like, let's say I wanted to nuance it by, group it by House and Senate. Well, the formula would end up becoming quite a bit longer. It would become more cumbersome, and it's a big pain in my butt. Fortunately, pivot tables exist to make this task of grouping and summarizing data a whole lot easier. So now let's do the same thing that we just did using pivot tables instead of having to write long and complicated formulas. The way to do that is to select a cell inside of your data, click under the Insert tab in Excel 2007, say Pivot Table. It will automatically select the entire bounds of your data, which is all 2,259 rows, and put it in a new worksheet, and I'll click OK. And here it gives me the pivot table dialog, which you've already seen if you've ever tried doing a pivot table before. So firstly, I want to point your attention to the row in the columns. What we want in our summary table are the rows and the columns that we just looked at. So if I recall correctly, the description says whether someone is an incumbent or a challenger. I'll just drag the description into the column, and the the party is the row that we used, and I'll drag that into the row. And so you can see already there's actually quite a few more parties that I didn't include. There's dim and rep, which I looked at just a moment ago, but now it includes all the other parties that have been registered. And there's a blank field in the description field, and then there's an open field too. It's not just challenger and incumbent. But here it is. It's given me a unique list of challenger, incumbent, open, and the individual parties. And now all I have to do is select the data that I want to include, and if I drag name into the values column, it will give me counts, as you look over here in cell A3, of the individual elements in the name field. So basically, this table is exactly the same table we looked at a moment ago. If I highlight this field now, it says 305. It means there's 305 Democrat challengers in the race. Now that by itself was a whole lot simpler than writing a long formula in order to, match, count the number of instances of the expression dim in the party list and count the number of corresponding instances of the expression challenger in the description list. This was just drag and drop, and we have these really handy-dandy little counts. It's also very easy to drag even more fields into our pivot table. If I want to take these this party list here and break it out by state, I can drag state into this row blank, and now my data is grouped not just by parties but also by state. So right here I can see that in AK Alaska there is a single Republican challenger. So and so over here, let's just do another one. There are 13 Democrats in Arkansas who are running in open races. I hope that you're beginning to see how pivot tables can be so powerful, because basically I have all of these fields here and I can mix and match them any way that I want to get a sense of what's going on inside of the database. And this is super powerful for large databases like the one that we're looking at, because when somebody sends you a file with 2,500 rows in it, the first thing you need to do is get a grip on what in the world is going on inside of that file. And pivot tables enable you to group and summarize that data to give you a sense of what's going on in the file. And you can mix and match in these row, value, column, and filter, we'll show in a few moments, areas to create just an arbitrarily large number of a very large diversity of different types of tables to give you a sense of the different things that are going on in there. So we can also, instead of counting names, we can look at the amount of cash that they have on hand, because that was one of our fields, and we can just drag that into values. I'm going to change the function for that to sum. I'll do this a little bit more slowly again in a minute. And here is a description of the amount of cash. The incumbent Republican in Alaska has so far, at this present moment, has a bank account with $419,000 in it. So it's very, very useful, very quick, interesting stuff. So let's go back to our presentation. What are pivot tables for? The answer is they are for summarizing and grouping data. There is nothing mythic or anything that should be intimidating about pivot tables. They are for chopping up your data and doing subtotals and counts and averages to help you get a sense of what's going on inside of that data. That is all pivot tables are. Now that you have a little taste of how they work, here's just some basic guiding suggestions for how to use them. Pivot tables are excellent for exploring data. If you have a big data set and you don't know what's in it, pivot tables are a very, very quick, fast way of getting inside of it. And they also give you an excuse to use the rawest data possible. So when my clients have data that they need me to analyze, I want sort of the most raw, basic, elemental data points. And pivot tables are so fast and efficient at grouping and summarizing that data that I don't care how much data they send me. I mean, the current versions of Excel each can accommodate spreadsheets of 1 million lines, and pivot tables are a particularly fast way of grouping and summarizing. So big old data sets can be explored quickly and easily with pivot tables. And this second suggestion that I have is a little bit more ambiguous, but I think it's a good rule, which is to use pivot tables everywhere you can. Because I have been in so many situations where I've written long and elaborate formulas to try to do complicated things, and spent a lot of time and made my computer buckle under the computational pressure I was putting under it, and then realized after hours that a pivot table could have been used to solve the grouping and summarizing problem I had very quickly. Pivot tables are just an incredible place for exercising your own creativity. So the first thing I ever do when somebody gives me a data set is stick it in a pivot table and take a look at it. This is why I think it's probably the second most important thing you can learn in regards to Excel. So now, just as a quick review, I'm going to talk a second about the specific types of data that are and are not amenable to being incorporated into pivot tables. And then after I do that, I'm going to go back through some of the elements a little bit more slowly to show you some of the nuances of the features. But if you have the wrong kind of data for pivot tables, there's no point in using pivot tables. You'll get weird and crazy results. So let's talk about that type of data. First, let's think of the shape. The data that you put in a pivot table needs to be tabular. It needs to be in a 2x2 grid. So let's look at our data again originally. This, and I can sort of zoom out a little bit, you can see this is a big 2x2 tabular grid of data. It may originally have come from a database where they had a list of candidates and a list of transactions and a list of parties, and that database would have consolidated it all together into a single tabular visualization that the pivot table can read. If you have two different data tables, your pivot table will not be able to handle that. The pivot tables are designed to take a single 2x2 set of data. There are super advanced things you can do to use Excel to help you consolidate data that comes from multiple sources, but we're not going to get into that today. As a general rule, you need a 2x2 array of data. The second thing, each row needs to be about the same sort of thing. So let's take another look at our data again, and I'll scroll down here to the bottom. So what does this row mean? This is, in this last record here, is Andrew Zukowski's report for 2009 and 2010. That's what the row means. If I were to add another row that had the name of Zukowski's dog in it, and say Zukowski's dog was named Fido, that would be very bad. If I had different types of rows, because the pivot table assumes that each row in this data array is an individual's report for that year. And if I have a row that has an individual's dog name too, it's going to look at that and misinterpret it. So it needs to be a pretty regular type of data set, in the sense that each row needs to have the same basic type. So let's take another look. Here is another very simple rule that you should consider when you're contemplating putting things into a pivot table. It's a rule that you can break almost immediately, but I find it to be very orienting when it comes to understanding what it is that pivot tables are actually doing. Summarize with numeric data and group with categorical data. So numeric data is just what it sounds like. It's numbers. The dollar transactions, for example, would be a numerical data. And a categorical data would be an individual, a name, a location, a building. It would be a type of data that simply wasn't numeric. There's different types of analytical things that you can do with categorical versus numeric data. With categorical data, you're interested in counting it. You may want to get the mode of it. With numeric data, you might be more interested in the mean or the median or the average or something like that, or the sum. But basically, when you're contemplating using a pivot table for the first time with a given data set, and you're trying to figure out what to put in your rows and your columns, which group your data, and what you're trying to put in your values area, which summarizes your data, generally you'll put numbers in your values and categorical data like state, party, and description in your rows and columns, generally. I'll repeat something else. It's a good idea to use pivot tables for raw data, or as raw data as you can get. This particular data set that we're looking at doesn't have every single contribution in it. It has those contributions grouped together into a subtotal. But because pivot tables are so powerful, to the extent that it's possible, it's a good idea to get the rawest data that you can get, because the pivot table, unless it's more than 1 million lines, will not have any difficulty grouping it and summarizing it together. One of the things that happens if you get data from people and the data's already been summarized is that it may be summarized using assumptions that the person preparing the data wasn't aware of, or they may have made mistakes. They sort of mutate the data in ways that, as an analyst, you might find objectionable. So as raw as you can get it is the way to go. Now that I've told you these simple answers, a more complicated approach would be to recognize that you can, in fact, I wrote summarize with numeric data and group with categorical data. I actually meant the opposite. You can group with numeric data and summarize with categorical data. So what we did over here when I took the cache out and I counted the names as they correspond to challenger, incumbent, and state and party. That's categorical data. It's being summarized with the count function. So you can break that rule, but I just find it orienting to think like I put numbers and values, I put categories and rows and labels. And as I said a moment ago, the data doesn't have to be raw. So let's take a closer look at the elements inside of the pivot table. Here is my short list of the things that are really important to know. Summarizing and grouping. Hopefully by now you have a sense of what I'm doing when I'm summarizing and grouping the data that we're looking at. We can also filter the data. Let me come back over here. Let's say I'm interested in this particular set of data, but I only want to see the counts of challengers and incumbents who are going for House seats rather than Senate seats. I can drag this office field over to the report filter, and it will give me the option of filtering that name count data by House or Senate, House for H. So if I click H, it will change all of my data. And so this looks only at challengers and incumbents, Democrats and Republicans in states, for people who are running for House seats. And so filtering is another sort of way you can add a dimension to your data. You can also filter right in the rows and columns. So with these drop boxes here, I can select, say, just the challengers, and that will show me only the challengers. And if I can filter over here and get rid of, actually, I'm highlighting states right now. Let's highlight the party. I can look only at Democrats. So this only shows the Democrats by state who are challengers for the House. So filtering is another powerful way of adding a dimension to your data. If you look right now at this particular pivot table, we have gone really deep into this data. I mean, we have office, state, party, description, and name. We have 5 different dimensions we're using to summarize this data. So once you are using a type of data that you're really familiar with, pivot tables are wonderful because you can just go crazy mixing and matching to explore the data. So the next thing I want to show you, it has to do with the formatting and the function. So I'm taking out the name values, and let's put in the total receipts. And the total receipts, as you probably recall from looking at the data itself, the total receipts is a dollar amount. It's a dollar amount that they have received, that each individual candidate has received since January 2009. And this is a number, and it needs to be formatted like currency the way it is here. I also have the function that's being applied to it is the count function. It's just giving me, again, the count of people, or the count of non-blank instances of receipts. So I can click this drop box and go to value field settings and change it to sum, and sum will show me the sum total of that total receipts field. If I click OK, so now it's showing me these totals. And I can also go back to the value field settings drop box and click on number format and use that to format it as currency. So I go to currency. I don't need any decimal places. I'll get rid of decimal places and click OK. And so now we have neatly formatted by currency sums of the total receipts for each candidate. So when you're playing around with pivot tables, feel free to hit on these little drop boxes for each cell. And do whatever options it gives you to change how your data is displayed or how your data is calculated. Oh, one more thing that you need to know about how pivot tables are calculated. When I created a pivot table on the basis of candidates, it actually cached a copy of my data set. So if I go back and change some element of that data, it will not automatically update inside of the pivot table. I have to manually tell the pivot table to refresh. So let's just do that real quick. If I sort this, it will bring Alaska up to the top. Here is my Democratic challenger. Let's say this Democratic challenger has suddenly received $100 million. This will not update automatically. I have to go over to options under the pivot table ribbon and click refresh, and it will automatically, and then it will update. So just keep in mind, if you're working with pivot tables that have data that changes, you need to make sure that you press refresh when necessary. And I'm just going to undo out of that. Okay. I'm going to make a mistake. So let's see if you, as you're watching, can figure out what I'm doing wrong. I'm going to switch to a slightly different data set. Here I have our people who are running for office. But instead of looking at the numbers of the amount of money they're raising, I'm looking at the years that they have submitted applications. Now, just as a warning, I actually just sort of dummied up this data myself. But basically, what's happening here is that instead of each row representing somebody's report for January 09 to the present, each row represents a year that somebody has run for office. So we have these, 2007. This row means that Mac Thornberry ran in 2007. But let's just say I don't really care about years. I just want to know how many of these individuals went into, how many people ran total in the past couple of years. So if I create a pivot table, let's say I want to break out the total number of people who've run by party. I can send party over here, and I can send name over here. And this is my pivot table. So I might think that what I'm looking at now is the count of individuals who've run in the past couple of years for each party, but I've made a mistake. And since I can't talk to you because of what I'm doing right now, I'm just going to tell you what the answer is. So hopefully some of you have made the connection. The data that we're looking at does not have as its individual row single people. Like people will repeat from year to year. So if I go back here and I sort it by name, I can see that David Vitter, for example, ran for office in both 09, 07, and 08. And that's because the basic row, a row in this data set is not a person, it's a person who applied in a year. So the person's name will actually repeat. And the reason the pivot table I created just now is wrong is because a lot of these people are double counted. Because because the sort of basic row element is not a single person. The basic row element is a single person applying within a given year. So there's been, in the past couple of years, 667 Democrat applications people who ran for office, or instances of people running for office, but there's a smaller number of people in that set, and that's just an area that is a particularly sticky area of pivot tables. And what you need to do is just always remember what each row of your data means. If you are trying to summarize a repetitive element in your data, make sure that those elements aren't repeated in your pivot table. So I'm beginning to run out of time, but I think I can probably go a few more minutes and still have time for questions. I'm going to give you some very quick tips on how to present pivot tables. First is this question of pivoting. Like, what does it mean to pivot data? Well, let's pivot some data. If I were to go back to our original pivot table, and maybe we can simplify it a little bit. We have party, Democrat, and description challenger. I could, if I wanted, move description over here and party over here into the column. And what I've done is I have pivoted my table. So instead of party being a row, it's now a column, and the same thing for description. So what does it mean to pivot the table? Not much. Pivoting by itself is not really, where the big value of this feature comes from. It's really about grouping and summarizing. Now, the expression pivot table sounds really cool. It sounds intimidating for people who don't know that pivot tables are just about grouping and summarizing data. So it's up to you as to the extent to which the people who are consuming your analysis need to know that it really isn't that difficult, because it's very simple. I would not ever get hung up on the word pivot when it comes to pivoting data, because you may actually use pivot tables without literally pivoting data. I also want to say that you can handle complex pivot tables much better than your audience. If we go back over here and create our sort of complicated pivot table that we just had, where we have 6 or 5 different fields represented. If you've created the pivot table yourself, you're going to know what it means. But before you show it off to anyone else, I would pause briefly and ask, how hard will it be for somebody who didn't actually create this pivot table to understand what it means? And I just remember many years ago I was giving a presentation to a president of a bank, and I gave him this pivot table that had like 6 or 8 different variables in it, and I thought, hey, this guy's a president of a bank, he's definitely going to be able to understand this, but I ended up having to spend 10 minutes explaining it to him. He loved it, he thought it was great, but it was sort of, my desire was not to give a tutorial on pivot tables. I had a point I was trying to make. It may be that in the context of your exploration of your data through pivot tables, you may want to go back and simplify it before you actually present it to somebody. Just a suggestion. And if you do want to do that, if you do want to send your pivot table to somebody, you will very often want to put it in a new spreadsheet. And that's because you don't necessarily want people to see all of your raw data. You may just want them to see your summarized data. So if I were to do that just very quickly, I just did select all to copy it, and I would create a new sheet. And the way I would do it would be to do paste special values, and that way I'm only getting the values. I'm not actually pasting the entire pivot table itself. And I'm pretty sure I can go back and paste special the formatting too. So there you go. I just pasted the values in the formats. There are no functions in here. This is just summarized data. If you want to share pivot tables with people that you've created it for, it's a good idea to jump it to a new sheet and get it outside of the original data set. Okay. So let's very, very quickly take the pivot tables into another dimension. I'm going to do some complicated stuff very quickly, but I just want you to see how far you can go with pivot tables in terms of creating really impressive visualizations. Here's a common problem if you have data that you want to group for pivot tables. What if your data doesn't actually contain the categories that you want to use to group? So for example, let's say I want to look at the money raised by politicians who live in the same zip codes as the people watching this webinar. Now, that might sound kind of like a crazy thing to go after, because certainly the Federal Election Commission website isn't going to have the data about the people who are attending O'Reilly webinars. But as it happens, it really isn't that difficult to take that data and bring it over into the data set we're using. Actually, let me find my data here. So what I have I'm just going to delete these 2 sheets because I'm not using them anymore. So here I have a sheet inside of the spreadsheet, which you may have downloaded, that contains the zip codes of the participants who are involved in this webinar right now. And in fact, there's my mom. Hi, Mom. 32205. There are, I don't know, let's see, a few hundred zip codes here. And in order to have a pivot table that filtered our candidate data by zip codes, we would need a field in this database that says that says whether that individual person lives in the same zip code as somebody who's on the webinar. And so what we need to do, I'll just call that field zip match. And what we need to do is create a formula that looks up the zip codes and returns, like, say true or false, depending on whether there's a match between the zip code for this candidate and the zip codes that we have listed for our webinar attendees. So I'm going to tighten these fields up a little bit. Those hash marks mean basically that there's just too much data to display with the column width the way it is. So I'll create the formula. It's a long formula, so don't be overwhelmed. I can talk about it in more detail in question and answer if you're interested. But it's basically not is error, oops, VLOOKUP. I want to look up this value in this range. So I know that for 99504, there basically is nobody in the webinar who's watching. So nobody from that zip code was able to join us. So I'll take this data, I'll take this formula I just created and copy it for everybody. Looks like there's a few trues here, so there's somebody watching from 35801 in Alabama. And now what I want to do is go back to my pivot table and add that column that I just created. So I actually have to change the data source here because it doesn't automatically know that I just created a new column. So I can just go in here and add the in. Whoops. Hold on a second. Reference is not that. Actually, let me just start over again on that. Okay. So now if I scroll down here, in my field list, I have the zip match that I just created. I'll get rid of this other filter that I just had. Actually, I'm going to select everything here. I don't want to have these filtered. And I'll just click on zip match here and say true. I only want to look at records where there's a match between our webinar participants and the zip codes where people live. And that's it. So here is our summarization of incumbents and challengers for the various parties, but only for people who only for candidates whose home zip code matches the zip codes of the people who are participating in this webinar. So what did I just do? Well, using formulas, you can create your own categories that you would flow into pivot tables on your own. And the reason this is so incredible is because doing that, you are creating an analyses that are based on facets of your data that actually aren't in your original data set. So if you're like me in sort of a client vendor situation where I have a client giving me data, if they give me data and I can add some columns to it using information implicit in the data or cross-referenced with another information source, I can give them back a pivot table that groups their data based on fields that they don't even have. And like that is where pivot tables go from being simple grouping and summarizing to being just sort of stratospheric in their impressiveness. And that formula that I just used, VLOOKUP, along with the other formulas that I just used, is error and not, are all in the book and are things that I can discuss right now if that particular topic interests you. So I'm going to skip cleanup because we are already at 12:50, and if people ask questions about the things I was going to discuss then I can answer them. But otherwise, I'm ready to go to the next step.
Hey,
Catherine.
thanks, Michael. Yes, can you hear me, Michael?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. We have a lot of questions that came in, and I think that you've answered some of them during the course of your talk. But so
Okay.
I'm going to just jump around. You can also look there in this notepad over here on the left-hand side. Um, I People did want some clarification about what you meant by 2 by 2 or two-dimensional when you were talking about pivot tables.
Okay, sure. I'm sorry. Yes. I mean when I'm referring to two-dimensional, I just mean rows and columns, as opposed to like a single sheet is something that I would consider to be two-dimensional. The first dimension is the columns, and the second dimension is the rows. Multi-dimensional data would be something like what you find inside of a Microsoft Access database or another type of database, where you have multiple lists of data that are linked with codes. So for example, if I just have a business selling cell phones, I might have a customer list, and I might have a transaction list, and I might have a cell phone list, and all of those will be linked. In order for me to do a pivot table analysis on, say, the people who bought my cell phones, I would have to query my database to give me a single, table that was in a row and column format, as opposed to a bunch of tables that are linked together. Does that answer your question?
I'm sure it does.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. What?
So let me find another question. Here's one that just came in, and it was Bill asking, saying, I often collect times from various events to do analysis on progress from race to race and other information, and he says
Right.
he ends up fighting with Excel. Oh, do you want to? Well, we should ask the question for people listening.
Okay.
Fighting with Excel, trying to insist my times in date or time rather than the duration of time to complete an event. Is there a trick to treat time as a duration in a pivot table rather than as a date time?
Okay. This is there's actually a whole if Brian Sawyer, my editor, he's a marathon runner, and if I didn't know better, I would think that he had asked this question. There's actually a whole chapter in Headfirst Excel about date and time functions, and I hate dealing with dates and times inside of Excel. They're a big pain in the butt. So not knowing your specific data, not having it in front of me, I can say a few things about how dates and times work. Basically, within Excel, there's what data looks like and how it's represented under the hood. And through formatting, you can change the way the way pieces of information look. Dates are all integers. So the integer 1, if you formatted it as a date, would be January 1, 1900. Times are all fractions. So they're values between 0 and 0.99999. What I would suggest that you do is try to get comfortable manipulating those integer and fraction values directly as you're dealing with date and time information, so that you can keep track of what it is that you're doing. But unfortunately, not having your data in front of me, it's hard to say much beyond that. Still there?
Oh, I'm sorry, I hit mute. Forgive
Okay.
me. Once
No, that's
again,
okay.
I was going to say, people are asking if you can provide the URLs once again for your data.
Yeah. I'll put it on my blog, michaelmilton.net, but let me pull that up again. That's here we go.
And is
tinyurl.com.
Is this something that people can download right now?
Yeah, you can download it right now. The tiny URL has the spreadsheet that I just used, along with the extra sheets that I added into it. The original data, if you want to go back to the source, is the Federal Election Commission website. I polished up the data a little bit just to make it easier to understand, because the stuff that comes out of the government, the column headers are not are often kind of cryptic in what they it takes you a second to figure out what they mean. So I just tightened it up a little bit. It's the same data, but there you go. And I'll put this on michaelmilton.net later today. I'll put the whole presentation up there, and you can use this link and you can go along however you like.
Okay, thank you very much. So I just pushed that out to everyone, or I'm about to. There we go. That should open it in the browser for most people.
Oh.
Sorry about that. We don't want that. So I'm canceling
No, that's cool.
that. Okay. Yeah. Well, so people can get it right away if they want to. Someone is asking, can you explain the, boy, I'm just going to copy this and paste it over there.
Yeah, the formula?
Yes, the formula.
Is that Ken McCall? Okay. So there is a few things. All of everything that I just did in terms of formulas is right in the book. So VLOOKUP is a really kind of it's a very difficult formula to learn. At least I had a very difficult time learning it. It's designed. How would I say this? I mean, it's designed to look up data from another list. The isError formula returns true if the argument is an error. So basically the way VLOOKUP works is if I try to look up something on another list, it will return an error if that element is not found. Generally, I mean, there's some. It depends on the arguments used, but I set it up so that if there wasn't a match with the zip codes that we just looked up, it would return an error, and that would make the isError formula return true. The not formula takes a true value. It takes a true value and returns false. So if isError returned true, that there was an error in the lookup, not makes it into false, and false means that there's no match. False in the context of the spreadsheet I was just creating means that there's no match between the person on the list and the people on either lists for zip codes. VLOOKUP is a long formula. I mean, truly, it took me 2 days to learn how to use it when I was first trying to figure it out. It's the very last thing that I cover in Headfirst Excel, but it's very powerful and worth your while. It's a great way to take data from another source and bringing it into the tabular 2x2 array that you're dealing with, with your own data.
Great. So a couple things. First of all, you did say that you'd have the presentation available on your site, which is michaelmilton.com.
michaelmilton.net. Yes, that is correct.
So, okay.
Here we go.
And then we have a few more questions, but someone just asked what the audience level is for your new book, Headfirst Excel. And
sure. I assume you know nothing. Basically when the website goes live, I'm pretty sure that my editor Brian's going to post the first chapter, and you can look at the first chapter to see if it's your level. But I assume that you know how to save and print and that kind of stuff. But I start from the very, very bare bones beginning in terms of using formulas. Because, like I said, I think formulas are the most important thing, and I think everybody needs to be a formula expert. But I start from the absolute very beginning. You can know nothing. Headfirst data analysis alternative, on the other hand, assumes that you know a little bit about how Excel works, not a whole lot, but a little bit. But Excel presumes no prior knowledge.
Great. It's a book that's much needed. So Marcy just pasted the discount code in the chat room, which is one of the best ones you can get anywhere. So it's 40% off print books, 50% off ebooks, and that's when you order from O'Reilly. Sorry for the sales pitch. But Michael, a lot of people are asking this very important question. How did you resolve the double counting problem?
Well, okay, sure. Firstly, the thing you would want to do, I'll just do it quick and dirty for you. Let me see here. So here is actually, you know what? I just deleted the sheet. I got to bring it back up again. Hold on a second. All right, so here is by year is the spreadsheet that has repetitive elements of names. So if I do if I sort, you can see these repeated names, and I just want to count the individual names. The easiest way to do that would be just simply to copy the names to a new worksheet. And I could, under data, there is a remove duplicates command. And there you go. It removes the duplicates. But of course, actually, this probably isn't terribly helpful to you because you don't just want to know how many individual names there are. I mean, you could create a pivot table out of this that counts the number of names. But what we actually want to know is names and party affiliation. So I would copy that, put it into a new table. I would get rid of these fields which we don't necessarily need right now, and then once again I would go to remove duplicates. It would click OK. It says 688 duplicates found, 428 remain, and then I could just simply create a new pivot table off of that. And then I could just put party over here and name over here. And so this is an actual and accurate count. Because we got rid of 600 duplicates, we don't have 1,100 total. This is the correct count of individuals who have run by party for that period of time. Now, as I'm doing this, I realize that if somebody switched party, that might end up being confounded from year to year. But if this is your data and you're dealing with this, then you're going to come up with ways of accommodating party switches and stuff. But that's basically how I would do it. This little feature, remove duplicates, is new to Excel 2007, and it's just wicked. I mean, it actually, before you'd have to go through a whole bunch of steps in order to remove duplicates, and that button by itself almost justified the upgrade to me of Excel 2007. So, any more questions?
We have a lot of questions, but I think we're running out of time. I notice that people are starting to drop off. Yeah?
We can do another. Let's do one more. I'll be quick.
Okay, how about this? Brian was asking earlier, if the data set increases the number of line items used in the pivot table, will the refresh feature include all data, including the new line items in the data set?
Sure. So basically, if you have if you have a data set and you end up adding rows to it, will the pivot table refresh? That's a really good question. I just added a column to some data and it didn't refresh automatically. But if you add rows, it'll be the same thing. It will not automatically refresh unless, this is a big unless, you turn this particular data set into what is known as a table. And a table is one of these other things that is new to Excel 2007 that I didn't get into. It's really ugly, but I won't do it right now, but you can make these ugly lines go away. But basically, if you describe your data set as a table and point the pivot table to that table, then that table is designed to automatically resize when you add rows or even columns. So if you find yourself in that position a lot, learn about the table feature a little bit. It's another one of those handy Excel 2007 features.
That's great. So are you saying that people using Excel 2003 are out of luck?
You know what? I mean, if I were not writing a book on it, I would not have upgraded. And all of my tech reviewers were the same way. The tech reviewers hadn't upgraded yet. But once I started doing my homework on Excel 2007, I was very impressed by it. And those features, like the ones I just mentioned, are very valuable. Probably not too valuable unless you have a certain base of knowledge in Excel. But they're big time savers for me. They're worth the price of the upgrade. Of course, Excel 2010 is going to come out in just a couple of weeks or months. I'm not really sure I think the date is June or something like that. But it's worth checking out too. I do think it's worth upgrading. And I'm no show from Microsoft, so.
Have you seen 2010 yet?
Yeah, I mean, I have the beta on my machine, and our as the tech reviewers went through Excel, Headfirst Excel, they tested everything that I did in it against the Excel 2010 beta, and that I'm very impressed with what Microsoft's been doing in recent years. And again, like I have no reason. I mean, I'm not an apologist for Microsoft. They have failed to impress me on many occasions previously, but as far as Excel goes, it seems to be a product that's improving rapidly in terms of user interface, in terms of the quality of the functions. So it's worth upgrading. I would say that. That's my opinion.
Okay, and we're about to wrap up, but I just a couple things, curious questions people ask that I'm curious too.
Okay, sure.
Why you're using
Sure.
the Windows version, and I know you've explained that to me before, why you're using Windows rather than Mac right now. And another question altogether, do you know of OpenOffice? Okay. Go on.
Sure.
I'll ask you another one.
So okay, shall I go now?
Yes.
Okay. I am a Mac person. I operate on the Mac. Most people who use Excel are operating on Windows, so I use a piece of software called Parallels, which is it's a virtual machine. I'm sorry, I just lost that word. That allows me to run Windows Vista inside of OS X. And so, out of deference to the people who are more than likely than not using Windows, I use the Windows version of Excel. All the screenshots from my book are in the Windows version too. There's some small differences with the Mac version. I actually like the user interface of Excel 2007, the Windows version, a little bit better. So that's what it is. And oh my goodness, Catherine, I forgot the second question. What was it again?
Oh, it was about OpenOffice. Do you know if OpenOffice
right.
has pivot tables?
I'm pretty sure it does. It's actually, honestly, it's been a year or so since I've even fired up OpenOffice. But I think, oh man, I read about this a few weeks ago. I think they have pivot tables, but call it something different. But I'm not really. Yeah, just Google OpenOffice pivot tables. I'm sure you'll get the answer to that. The type of functionality of pivot tables in terms of grouping and summarizing is something that is replicated in a lot of different types of software platforms. Like SQL, the database that the language people use to query databases, has a lot of grouping and summarizing functions too. You can do a lot of the same things. R, which is a up-and-coming and popular statistical package, has some functions for grouping and summarizing. It would surprise me very much if that functionality wasn't replicated in OpenOffice, but you'll have to pardon me for not knowing it off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it. We've gone over quite a bit, and you've been great. I'm so impressed with everything you know. What a great webcast. But I think we should wrap it up now. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us for this, and thank you, Michael, for doing it. We'll have you can visit Michael's site to download all the information he talked about, and we'll have the recording available shortly, so we'll send it to all you guys. And
fantastic. Thank you, everybody, from me too.
Yes, so I'm going to close out the meeting now. Oh, and one last thing. If you
Okay.
get a chance, please take our post-webcast survey, not you, Michael, but everyone else, just to give us feedback on the event. That helps us improve it. It's very short. It'll pop up in a window when you're done here. So once again, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.